Let's take this opportunity to look at the definition of direct and indirect costs and, if appropriate, challenge that definition. Cost definitions have evolved over the many years of preparing accounts. Now, traditionally, costs were expressed on an income statement as cost of goods sold or overheads. Cost of goods sold were traditionally limited to raw materials in a manufacturing environment, or in a retail environment, perhaps the purchase costs of the item that was going to be on-sold. The rest of the costs were typically lumped into overheads. But for some businesses, they simply didn't think that this definition suited them. Let's look at service firms as an example. They didn't have any cost of goods sold in the traditional manufacturing sense. They weren't buying any raw materials, and they didn't purchase any goods that they then on-sold, so they didn't think they aligned with the retail environment. So typically, they would put all of their costs into overheads. But unfortunately, that process limited their ability to understand how their costs would change if their business scale or their volume changed. So over time, the definition of costs evolved to costs that had a direct relationship to earning the revenue and those that did not. And so was born the terms direct cost and indirect costs. If you are still using a traditional definition of costs on your income statement, maybe this is a good opportunity to challenge those costs prior to coming into the Real-Time CEO app. Because in the Real-Time CEO app, there are some really powerful modeling tools that are going to give us the opportunity to see what our costs look like or will look like if our business changes scale. And in order for those modeling tools to do their job, we need to have a really accurate definition of costs and, just as importantly, an accurate definition of variability. One of the most common questions that we receive when we're giving keynote addresses or business improvement workshops is, what is the best definition or the correct definition of direct versus indirect costs? I can tell you categorically that there is no black or white, no right or wrong definition of direct versus indirect costs. The most important thing is to come to a definition that suits your business and then be consistent from period to period using and applying that definition. One of the more powerful insights that you can get to a business's operating performance is how the costs change over time as revenue changes. So consistency of definition is absolutely critical. Here are some guidelines on what to think about as we're defining our direct and our indirect costs. First of all, direct costs, as their name would suggest, are typically related to earning revenue. And typically, but not always, they are variable. In other words, they're going to increase and decrease as revenue increases and decreases. Let's have a look at this from a slightly different angle. I'd like you to imagine that you're about to purchase a business. You're on the acquisition trail, and in front of you, you have the business, the target business's income statement, and you're looking at the costs that they incur in their business. Some of those costs will continue after you've acquired the business. Some are less likely to continue. The ones that will continue after you acquire the business are likely to be direct costs. By way of example, raw materials in business are absolutely a direct cost. Wages associated with making, selling, or delivering the product or service, we believe, are direct costs. So, for example, they may be factory wages in a manufacturing environment. They may be selling wages in a retail environment. And in a service environment, the salaries of your fee earners, the people who are producing the work that is then going to get sold to the client base. They are all, in our opinion, direct costs. Let's have a look at indirect costs now. These have no direct relationship to earning the revenue and generally are more fixed than variable. In the long term, no cost in business is fixed. All costs over the long term are variable. But I'd like you to think about this within a more defined time period. Let's say, for instance, within a 12-month time period, where many of the costs in the business are either fixed or what are referred to as step costs. They go up in lumps and then stay at the same level for some period of time. Once again, if we utilize the other view of considering costs in a company that we're going to purchase, there may be a series of costs that you simply don't think that you need to replicate because you have existing functions that are going to be able to perform those tasks, whether they be administrative or accounting or receptionists. You have those resources currently and they have capacity to take on the responsibilities of the business that you're going to buy. So by way of examples, a rent is a good example of an indirect cost because if you have spare capacity, that's unlikely to go up. It's likely to remain fixed until such time as you hit your capacity and you need to take on more space. Administration costs, insurance costs are going to remain predominantly fixed until you hit capacity and you need additional resource. Let's take a look at this direct versus indirect concept in a diagrammatic fashion and look at the traditional calculation in the income statement and the disadvantages associated with that, and then compare that to the evolved definition and the advantages associated with that. So traditionally an income statement will list revenue less cost of goods sold, will give you gross profit, take off overheads, and you come up with your net profit calculation. Now clearly the disadvantage here is that if we have a number of variable costs sitting down in our overheads, we have less ability to apply the correct variability to our costs, so our estimates of future costs is going to be less accurate. Compare that to the evolved definition of costs where we have revenue less direct costs gives us a new term called contribution margin. So called because out of our sales revenue, once we've removed all direct costs, how much is going to be left to contribute towards indirect costs and contribute towards profit. From contribution margin, we deduct indirect costs and that brings us to net profit. So because we've got more of our variable costs included in direct costs, we now have an advantage that we can apply the right cost variability to make future estimates of costs more accurate. If you are still using the traditional definition of costs, why don't you take this opportunity to challenge that definition so that you'll get more benefit out of the powerful modeling tools that you will receive in the Real-Time CEO app.